As I start this video, which I know is going to make some people upset, I would like to be clear that I hold Magic Johnson in very high regard as a player. He is number 6 on my all-time player ranking list. He is the clear best point guard in NBA history to me, and I also believe that he is the best pure passer in the history of the NBA. This man is an absolute legend, and together with Larry Bird, he took this league from the doldrums of the 70s to the exciting, phenomenal experience that it has now become. However, while Magic Johnson is one of the best and winningest players in NBA history, making 9 finals appearances and winning 5 of them, I think that the context around his support and his competition tends to be overlooked sometimes when people discuss just how great of a player Magic was. And so that's what I want to do today. This video is not designed to put down Magic Johnson or say that he wasn't some kind of great player, because he absolutely was. But I would just like to add a little bit of context to how much success the Los Angeles Lakers had with Magic Johnson as one of their stars. Let's start with Magic's rookie season in 1980, the year that he won a championship and Finals MVP next to prime Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Now, of course, the context of this is that Kareem missed Game 6, and as a result, Magic had what I still consider the greatest single-game performance in NBA history. This man had, in my opinion, the best basketball game that anyone has ever played, ever. It was incredible, and I do think he deserved the Finals MVP, even though Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was clearly still the better player. And I would say, through up to 1982, Kareem was not only the best player on this team, but the best player in the entire NBA. And I don't think this is much of a misconception. I feel like most people recognize that until probably 1985, 1986, Kareem was still the best player on the team, and Magic was the number 2. However, when I hear people talk about the early 80s Lakers, before James Worthy got to the team, Magic and Kareem are portrayed as this superstar duo who carried their team to the finals year in and year out. And frankly, this just couldn't be further from the truth, because this Lakers team was still stacked even at the start. Magic Johnson in his rookie year, despite starting off incredibly strong already, was only the 4th best player on his team, behind Kareem at number 1, and then Norm Nixon and Jamal Wilkes at 2 and 3. These guys made all-star teams during the beginning of the 80s, playing next to Magic and next to Kareem. They were very, very good players, and this was a very, very good team, not a carry job. You were looking at a team with 4 all-star caliber players through 1982. That's like the 2018 Warriors of the 80s, okay? Maybe that's a slight exaggeration, but this team, while they didn't quite have the same star power as those Warriors, did have 4 legit all-star caliber players as well as depth. Their final guy in the starting 5 was Jim Chones, who is a pretty solid role player, and then Michael Cooper came off the bench, someone who would later win a Defensive Player of the Year and made 8 all-defense teams in his career, was already coming off the bench for this team in Magic's rookie season, and he would only get better as the years went on. So this team, from the very first year Magic played, was incredibly stacked, and they would only arguably get better. As in 1983, the team would draft James Worthy, and by 1985, he was playing at an all-star caliber level. He didn't make the team until 86, but even in 85, the dude was giving you 18 points a game on 57% shooting, and he would give you something pretty similar to that throughout most of his prime. Up until 1992, James Worthy every season was giving you about 21 points a game and shooting like 54-55% from the field. He was a very good scorer, a very efficient player, he was a solid defender, he had a little bit of playmaking in him, a little bit of rebounding. He was just a phenomenal third option for this team and a perfect transition partner for Magic Johnson. Now, once again, Magic Johnson best passer in NBA history, in my opinion. And we're talking like pure passers here. I think you can make an argument for other people as the best playmaker. I personally think it's Steph Curry because of gravity, but we're not getting into that today. But as a pure passer, as someone who is just really damn good at getting the ball from his hands to someone else on his team's hands, Magic Johnson was as good as it gets. This man averaged some absurd assist statistical marks throughout his career. But he did have really good teammates that he was passing to. I'm not saying that Magic Johnson wouldn't be the best passer ever if he didn't have such good teams, but I am saying that it is much easier to average 12 assists a game when you have 2 to 3 all-star teammates than it is when you were the lone star on your team with not great help. Like Nikola Jokic this season is averaging 8 assists a game, playing with bums. If Nikola Jokic had better teammates, he would easily be averaging 10 assists a game this year. Easily. Because every single game, you see his teammates botch wide open, easy looks that a good player should be making. I got a little off topic here, but the point is, Magic Johnson was helped on offense by how good his teams were. And this is not just in his playmaking, but in his scoring, as once again, Magic Johnson in his best seasons, he was an incredibly efficient player, especially from the free throw line. People don't realize, Magic Johnson led the league in free throw percentage in 1989. He was a phenomenal free throw shooter, alright? As well as being very efficient from the field, shooting 52% for his entire career. However, these things are easier to do when you have an incredible team. So while Magic was an amazing scorer and a truly phenomenal playmaker, it should be noted just how much help he had on these teams to achieve the incredible numbers that he did. It would not have been as easy for Magic to do if he didn't have so much freaking help. And even as Kareem fell off at the end of the 80s, like really fell off in his last 2 seasons, that dude should not have made an all-star team at the age of 41. I'm sorry, he just shouldn't. But Kareem was a legitimate all-star through 1987, and the team had some great role players too. Byron Scott was not quite an all-star, but he wasn't too far from being one either. Michael Cooper continued coming off the bench and, like I said, won a freaking Defensive Player of the Year award in 1987 off the bench, and AC Green was on this team for a while. The Iron Man, the ultimate Iron Man in NBA history actually, and just a very consistent, very solid role player for an already stacked team. This team didn't just have star power, they had depth. And I know what you're thinking right now. It's something along the lines of, yes, his teams were good, maybe even a little bit better than I realized they were, because seriously, I don't think most people knew just how stacked these rosters were. They were truly something else. But winning still matters, right? Winning still counts for something. And I would like to ask you people, how much do you count Kevin Durant's titles with the Warriors? How much do you count them? I agree that winning matters in any context, and I do think those titles are still valid, even though they're not worth as much as most other titles. It's still a big deal when you go and win a title. That is a huge deal. But I think that the same context needs to be applied to Magic's championships as is applied to Kevin Durant's. Because when your team is number one, so much better than everyone else, and number two, your competition just isn't all that great, your titles become less meaningful. And not only were Magic's teams stacked, but his competition was absolute garbage. The Western Conference in the mid-80s sucked. It sucked throughout pretty much the entire 80s, actually. It was really bad. SRS is not by any means a perfect, advanced metric, but looking at the strength of schedule of these championship teams, the toughest one in NBA history was the 1995 Houston Rockets with a 23.9 SRS ranking. The easiest was the Los Angeles Lakers in 1987 with 2.97. The second easiest one was the Los Angeles Lakers in 88. The fifth easiest was the Los Angeles Lakers in 85. Are you seeing a trend here? These teams did not face great competition at their best because the Western Conference freaking sucked. In 1987, the Western Conference standings looked like this. The Lakers were first with a 65-win record, very impressive. The second team was the Mavericks, who really weren't even a contender despite winning 55 games. And then you have the Blazers with 49 wins, the Jazz with 44 as the 4th seed, 44 wins. The Warriors and Rockets at 5th and 6th both had 42 wins. The Supersonics had 39, and the Denver Nuggets had 37. Now, when people talk about the Eastern Conference in the mid-2000s and the early 2000s, they talk about how weak it was, and you generally see records like this, where the bottom half of the playoffs are teams with 500 or below records. Well, this is the same situation that the Lakers were in the 1980s, except instead of being a team like the Nets, or the Sixers in 2001, or the Detroit Pistons, where these teams also weren't that amazing, they weren't that stacked, the Los Angeles Lakers were more like the 2008 Boston Celtics or the 2017 KD Warriors. Could you imagine if the Warriors played in not the average strength late 2010s West, but instead the god-awful competition of the early 2000s East? How much more embarrassingly easy would their title runs have been in this situation? And now, take that and apply it to the 80s Lakers, because the 80s Lakers were heads and tails above every single team that they played. When you look at the best teams in the West throughout the 80s, you've got teams like the Mark Aguirre Mavericks, that was just one dude and they weren't really that good. You've got the George Gervin Spurs, where he was carrying this team, but they weren't really that good. You had the Rockets, which were great in 86 with Hakeem and Sampson, but after that it was just Hakeem because Sampson got hurt. Or Moses Malone in the early years, including 1981, where they made the finals with like 42 wins, which is just insane that they beat the Lakers. You've got Clyde Drexler and the Blazers, good overall teams, 1 star. And then you've got the Phoenix Suns pre-Charles Barkley, where they had Kevin Johnson and Hornacek, and like a solid overall team, but not even close to the level of the Lakers. And before you say the Utah Jazz were not contenders in the 80s. Yes, the Jazz roster looked really stacked on paper, but in reality, they weren't actually that amazing. They were a good team, but they didn't really get it together until the mid-90s, so don't come out here and tell me they beat some like superb Jazz team that would make the finals later with Stockton and Malone. They weren't the same team in the late 80s as they would become later, okay? So, insanely stacked roster, incredibly lackluster competition. No wonder he made the finals 9 times. It would have been a massive disappointment any season that they did not. And in fact, both times they lost to the Rockets, it was a disappointment. They should not, that was a big upset. They should not have lost to those teams. Even the one with Hakeem and Sampson, they really shouldn't have lost to that team. That was an upset by them, or by the Rockets, over the Lakers. They were meant to make the finals that year and face the Celtics once again. Alright? And yeah, when they got to the finals, they usually played a pretty good team. Usually the Celtics, or they played the Sixers, who they lost to in 83. You know, they had good finals competition. But it sure makes it a lot easier when you made it through maybe the weakest conference in NBA history, certainly the weakest Western Conference in the 80s, and your competition in the East, in Bird or Philly or whoever, played an actual contending team in the conference finals to get to you first. So, Magic Johnson, absurdly great player. I am not trying to take anything away from him in this video. I just want to add a little more context to the legacy of Magic and the 80s Lakers and just how good these teams were. Because while they were great, and they do deserve a whole lot of praise, context is really freaking important when you talk about how great these teams were, because they beat a lot of bad teams while they had a lot of really stacked rosters, and that has to be factored in when you talk about the greatness of Magic Johnson, as well as Kareem and everyone else who played on these teams. Thank you for watching.